the singular pleasure of introducing a fellow Canadian philosopher, Dr. Rachel McKinnon. And she currently holds a prestigious Shirk postdoctor in philosophy at the University of Calgary. And as of fall 2014, she will be on faculty at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. Primarily, her work is in epistemology and philosophy of language, and her central project concerns the norms of assertion, and she has an extensive list of impressive publications in journals including Episteme, Metaphilosophy, and Phil Studies. Additionally, she is now widely known for her work in feminism and transgender advocacy, and has given many talks and keynote addresses and published in this area, and it is in this capacity that she's going to speak with us today. The title of her talk is Allies, Active Bystanders, and Gaslighting.
So thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me. I'm really impressed that you got this initiative up and going and that this is a multiple iteration of it, so it wasn't just a one-off. Like Carrie, I would like to note that my primary research areas are not feminism, even though this is actually probably what I'm best known for. And that is the capacity in which I will be talking today. So what I want to talk about are problems that I see with the concept and deployment of allies and what's known as ally culture, and how that connects to what's a newish term about gaslighting, and I'm going to connect that to epistemic injustice. I'm going to argue against the concept and deployment of allies and ally cultures. I'm going to talk about a lot of problems that are going on with this. Roughly, I'll argue that allies are creating more harm than good. I'll argue that we should replace the concept of allies with active bystanders, and I'll finish with some thoughts about how we move forward. Okay, so what is gaslighting? Well, the etymology is a little bit hard to track. Most people think that it started with a 1938 play, and it's more popularly known by the 1944 movie called Gaslighting, or Gaslight, I think. It takes two forms. The form that's deployed in the movie and the play is one of psychological warfare, psychological abuse, where people try to convince typically women or other disadvantaged groups that they're crazy, that they're not perceiving things properly. The form that I'll be talking about is much more subtle. It's usually much less intentional. And I'll connect it to epistemic injustice. So pretend that you're at a Christmas party at the end of a long semester. It's Friday night, it's been a long week, you finished your grading, you're trying to cut loose a little bit and relax. You have a drink, other people are drinking, and you're in a conversation with four people, one of whom is your department chair, not Richard, who says something sexist. Something like to a graduate student in philosophy, you know, women just aren't good at logic, maybe you should go into ethics or something. Okay, something inappropriate. And really worried by this, you talk to some of your colleagues who were also at the party, but maybe didn't hear that comment. And so maybe you have the following texting exchange with someone. You say that you're really upset, and they just say, well, you're overreacting. I know John, he's a good guy. He wouldn't do that. So now we're in the realm of gaslighting. And here are a whole bunch of different forms it might take. You might also be told, oh, please, this is bound to happen when someone is tired, stressed, drinking. Pick your adjective. Or maybe you're on Facebook chatting with someone, and someone says, look, don't be so upset. It's not that serious. It was just a joke. Or maybe in complaining about this as a wider pattern, someone tells you, look, this is just going to happen wherever you go. You need to get used to it. Or they might say, oh, wow, that sucks, but I've never seen him do that. Or you're just being emotional. Calm down. All these are instances of gaslighting. From some of the giggles, I suspect you've heard these sorts of phrases too. Well, I want to connect gaslighting to epistemic injustice, do a little epistemology here. So I'll be building on the great work by Miranda Fricker in her book, Epistemic Injustice. So epistemic injustice is when there's a pattern of incredulity, misinterpretation, or silencing where we don't take the speaker at their word. We don't treat them as a prima facie reliable resource of information. We don't give them the appropriate epistemic authority as a speaker, as a testifier. So as Fricker says, there's a credibility deficit. Now, she talks about two different forms. I'm going to focus on what she calls testimonial injustice, and that's where there's this credibility deficit based on someone's identity, which can be intersectional. So a woman, a person of color, queer, disabled, so on. So epistemic injustice, especially gaslighting, happens a lot when we're talking about harassment or sexual assault. So let's say that also at this horrible Christmas party, another person was sexually harassed, Jane, and she wants to complain to probably the department chair. And based on her being a woman, he will dismiss, discount, or doubt her claim that what she said happened really happened. And that might take different forms. It might be like, oh, well, what were you wearing? Right? You probably came on to him. All these sorts of forms that end in a case of testimonial injustice. Jane has asserted some proposition that a harassment has happened, and the person hearing it doesn't believe her on the basis of her testimony, partly because she's a woman. That's testimonial injustice. Gaslighting, I think, when we hear things like, well, he's a good guy, he wouldn't do that, besides he's married, which is something that was said to someone who just came out to me last week about a sexual assault. Gaslighting and this form of epistemic injustice is really common, and it's a really big problem. And the point should be that speaker testimony ought to be treated as a prima facie reason to treat the claim as true. But that's not what happens. Now, in Carrie's talk, she talked a little bit about how philosophers have this self-conception of ourselves as rational. We're trained in critical thinking, right? Well, I think philosophers are particularly bad when it comes to epistemic injustice and gaslighting. I think our training in taking some argument and thinking about any possible alternate explanation or theory, no matter how implausible, is a feature common to our profession. So if you think back to the McKinnon case, or now the Ludlow case, in the way that people are responding to what might have happened, and you read the blog posts and the blog comments, look how implausible people are willing to suppose a situation rather than just accepting the speaker testimony of what happened. So I think philosophy is particularly bad at this, and it's partly because of our training. So I'm going to pick on philosophers a lot today. All my examples are examples from philosophers, and so now I want to argue against allies and ally culture. So what are some of the reasons that allies are problematic? Well, when we have a problem, who do we complain to? Typically, we first go to people that we perceive as allies. We don't first go to the people we perceive as hostile. We go to the people we perceive as allies. And this creates some problems, because if the people we tend to only complain to will be allies, they will be, statistically speaking, more likely to gaslight us, just by sheer numbers game. Even though if we contrast allies to I guess people who are hostile to us, the hostile people might be more likely to gaslight, but we're not going to them, right? So we only go to the allies. That's why they're more likely to gaslight. The big problem, though, and this is what I'm going to focus on, is that allies are really hostile to criticism for unally-like behavior. So when we call them out, they often respond not by saying, oh my gosh, you're right, I screwed up. They attack. And we had a nice high-profile instance of this just a couple weeks ago with a certain Brian Leiter and me. But anyway, I want to talk about a distinction, though, that I came across of calling out versus calling in. And this is based on a blog post called Calling In, a Less Disposable Way of Holding Each Other Accountable. I put the link on your handout. The idea is that one way of distinguishing calling out is that it's public, the main purpose is often to shame, and it's meant as the end of a conversation. Now, while the Gender Conference campaign and posting links to conferences with all male lineups isn't really meant to shame, that's kind of its function. It's kind of the net effect. And the posts, when they go up on feminist philosophers, I think there are good reasons for this, don't have comments, right? It's not meant to be a conversation. It's meant just to point the bad behavior out, and that's it. That's calling out. Calling in is a little bit different. While it's also public, it's about getting the person who did the wrong thing to own their mistake and to use this as the beginning of a conversation, generally a healing conversation. Now, while it's difficult when you're the person who's been harmed, when you have these calling in conversations, you have to work hard to have compassion and patience for the person you're conversing with. You have to try and understand that, look, being called out sucks. It does hurt. Even though we don't want to focus on their pain, we have to at least take that into some consideration. So when we call out, that's where we're ending conversations, sometimes ending friendships. I mean, I've certainly ended friendships over bad crap that people have done when I tried to call them in. So a calling in I tried to have a calling in, it ended up turning into a calling out, and it ended friendship. So calling out is when we just draw attention to the error and basically nothing else. Whereas calling in is trying to get someone to own up to someone or something that they did wrong, and then you have a conversation about it. So here's an instance that happened a couple weeks ago on Facebook with one of my friends. So I posted this story, Offbeat Families. It's about a cis lesbian dyke woman who has a child but identifies as the father. Does not identify as mother, don't call her the mother. So not only does she identify with the social gender role stereotypes of fatherhood, she disidentifies with the social role gender stereotypes of mother, okay? Even though she still considers herself a woman, all right? So here's the comment that my friend posted. She said, "I certainly think that she should choose the identity that suits her, but these stereotypes are harmful to many, and sometimes it's important to see someone who challenges the norm. It's too bad that the term mother is so stereotyped that she can't use it. There are lots of reasons you may not want to be a girl, but if one of them is that you think you can't play sports, isn't that a shame?" I don't think this is the worst comment in the world, but I do think there's some serious problems with it, especially coming from a perspective of how things like, well, she should still call herself the mother and then just challenge the stereotypes and norms of motherhood. Why can't she just do that? Was essentially the content behind this comment. And in the context that this comment came out, especially when we're talking about gender nonconforming people, you have to understand that a lot of people turn to, say, transgender people when they're transitioning and say, well, if you just want to wear makeup and dresses and whatnot, why can't you do that and still be a boy? Right? Why can't you just change what it means to be a boy? So this is a form of dismissal that people often use for gender nonconforming people. And so that's what I saw in her comment. I saw that as a problem. And so I mentioned it in Facebook. And the point I wanted to make to her was that, look, she saw an identity box. While imperfect in a global sense, we have to understand that being able to look into society as a way of relating to each other is comfortable. Having a box is comfortable. And so we can't begrudge her for having a comfortable box. So here's a really nice example of this box-seeking behavior, and it's my girlfriend. So she's a cis lesbian, but she's not butch, she's not femme. And these are essentially the only two identities that get pushed in lesbian cultures. So she didn't have a box. She didn't know how to relate to other lesbian in the culture, how to talk about herself, how to relate to them. So she's somewhere in between femme and butch. I mean, she's complicated. That's a good thing. And she found it really stressful that she didn't have a box. And back in November, she read an essay by Esper Bergman called Diesel Femme. And it described her perfectly. She had a box. She cried. Right? Having a box for people is really important. And so while, yes, in a broad sense, it's great to challenge stereotypes, we have to realize that sometimes fitting social norms is comfortable. And so we can't begrudge the person for doing that. And this was the conversation I had with my friend. It was a good conversation. I think this is one of the most successful calling-ins I've ever had. Right? She recognized that what she said, while not intended to be that way, had that reading, had that problem. So good calling-ins have certain features. And the first is that the person who gets called in has to take public accountability for what they did, which involves a public acknowledgement. So while our conversation was mostly private, she went back into the public thread and said, "You're right, I screwed up. Thanks for having the conversation." Far too often, we keep it private. Right? We don't make the public acknowledgement. Okay, so let's say that you want to call someone in or call someone out. Where should our focus be? You could either focus on what they did or who they are. And we should focus on what they did. Don't focus on who they are. If you want to say to someone that that comment was sexist, you don't want to say that you are sexist. So here's a really awesome video.
Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're gonna have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable "that sounded racist" conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the "what they did" conversation and the "what they are" conversation. Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The "what they did" conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the "that thing you said was racist" conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The "what they are" conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the "I think you are a racist" conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say, "I think he's a racist," that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, "I think your ass is racist," when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy, because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a "what they did" conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a "what they are" conversation. "I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa." And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon, and you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late, because the "what they are" conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
So I can't recommend this video enough. I link to it a lot on Facebook. I send it to my students. I send it to friends. The message of accountability is key. And the message about accountability for actions, not who you are. I just had this conversation yesterday, in fact, in the airport before I was flying over here, about someone's blog post from a few years ago about what counts as philosophy and what doesn't, and how a few recent, more high-profile articles have been picking on that post as being problematic. And other philosophers were defending the original blog post person because he's really an ally, right? But that's not the conversation we're having. The conversation we're having is that the blog post has problems. We're not talking about whether he has problems, okay? So that's what I want us to focus on too. The other important point is I care about actions, I don't care about intentions. I think philosophers are far too deontological when we think about how things happen. We care way too much about intentions. We don't care that it had a bad outcome. So often when someone says something bad or does something bad and you say, hey, this was bad, this hurt, oh, but I didn't intend that. Well, good for you, I don't care. I just care that it hurt. So I want you to focus on that too. I want you to focus on actions and outcomes, not intentions. I'm not saying intentions don't matter at all. Certainly someone who says something racist and means it is worse than someone who says racist and doesn't, but they still said something racist. Okay? We have to hold them accountable for what they did, not what they intended. So here's an instance of something that happened to me at the University of Waterloo where I did my PhD. Sitting in a room, having a conversation with a couple friends, all three of us women, all three of us feminists, all three of us, in a sense, feminist philosophers. And the friend to my left, Kay, asked me whether or not I got the department slow pitch team going that summer, because we had the year before and had a lot of fun. I was saying, no, I didn't, but hey, C over here did agree to play for us. Isn't that awesome, right? At which point C said, yeah, but I throw like a girl. Now, coming from a feminist, that's kind of weird, right? Both of us jumped on her and said, no, you don't throw like a girl, you just throw poorly, right? Like this comic says, father to son, you throw like a girl raised in a patriarchal society that discourages women from participating in sports. And so we criticized her. We're like, hey, no, not throw like a girl. You throw poorly. That's fine. She acknowledges this, and then here's her response. Well, I throw like a girl without a penis. And as a trans woman sitting 5 feet away from her, my jaw was on the floor. This is super sexist, this is transmisogynistic, this is not okay. And my response was basically, I think I gasped out, wow, and then left. And then she, to some credit, apologized to me, like about half an hour later. But then almost immediately we got into but I didn't mean it, that was not my intention. What I meant, okay, I don't care. You said this horrible thing. Stop it at that. I don't want to hear about your intentions. In fact, that conversation is just aggravating me more, right? Because now it sounds like you're trying to defend yourself rather than just take accountability for what you did. So when you're called out, remember that it's what you said, not what you intended. Particularly for the person harmed, they do not care about your intentions. And you're bringing your intentions in makes it worse. So when you get called out or when you get called in, what you have to do first is relax, okay? We all understand that being called out sucks, especially publicly. But you can't immediately go on the attack. You have to reflect on what you actually did, what you actually said. And reflect on it from their perspective too. Not just thinking about what you actually meant or intended, okay? Think about what you actually said, what effect it might have actually had on the affected people. And then apologize. Just say you're sorry. In some of the research on what is involved in a genuine apology, you never make excuses. When you make a genuine apology, you do not make excuses, you do not make explanations. So just say you're sorry. And the last 2 points are that you have to own it and then commit to not doing it again. And often that step never gets reached. So if you say something super sexist, apologize, and then say, I'm sorry, that was horrible, won't happen again. Of course, that's a kind of a promise, and it might still happen again, but at least you're showing the other person that you're owning your bad behavior and that you're going to try to do better next time. And of course, do better next time. But all too often, when something bad happens, people apologize and that's it. But that can't be it. You have to do better and commit to the person you harmed to doing better. Now, when you're called out, that process especially if it's a calling in, is not about you. It's not about your feelings. It's not about how uncomfortable you are. It's not that you're unhappy for being called out publicly or whatever. Don't make it about you. And too often what we have are versions of what's called the tone argument, where we say things like, well, come on, you attract more flies with honey rather than vinegar, or more often, you need to calm down before we have this conversation. So back at the University of Waterloo, I had a lot of problems. I got mispronounced a lot, even by the department chair. And when I turned to an ally, I got sent an email with all sorts of gaslighting in it. Look, he's really an ally. He's really a good guy. It was the end of a long week. He had a couple drinks, right? Classic gaslighting. And I wanted to confront her about it, but I couldn't because at the time I was a sessional instructor. And her and the chair were the two people in charge of doling out teaching assignments. So I was in this massive power disadvantage. I wasn't in a place to confront them. Now, I also have a blog, which is on your handout. It's Metamorphosis, where I talked about some of these things, but I anonymized all the details. Right? I didn't use any names. I didn't even use positions or anything like that. And she thought my blogging about what happened and her gaslighting was completely inappropriate. So that 4 months later, when I was actually ready to have this calling in conversation, because I had my postdoc and a tenure track job, she said, no, it's too late. Right? You should have talked to me right away. Right? The time for that conversation is gone. And she's essentially cut off conversation. That's a tone argument. Right? You said these things about me even though they were anonymized, and now the conversation has to be on my terms. You didn't meet those terms. Too bad we're not having the conversation. Now, one of the problems here, often when someone gives a tone argument, especially when they're being called out, remember, you hurt someone. They're upset. And anger is a completely appropriate response to being harmed. But all too often, the person being called out or called in makes it about them and how uncomfortable they are. But you can't do that. So here's this fantastic thing that Melissa Draper calls the toes clause. If you tread on someone's toes and they tell you to get off, then get off and apologize. Don't tell them to ask nicely. When someone's calling you out for having harmed them, let it be about them. Don't make it about you. Okay. So these are problems, but I think these are big problems that allies engage in all the time. Remember the person who, one, gaslit me and then used the tone argument and then shut off conversation is the person everyone considers the top ally in the department. Okay, and this was a common pattern, not just in my department, not just with me, but just all over. And one of the reasons I think this has to do with how we conceive of what it means to be an ally, and that we wear it as an identity badge. Literally, these are actual badges that people have actually made that say they're an ally. They wear it as a badge. And some of these are almost nonsensical. This one I laugh at the most. 100% straight, whatever that means, 100% ally, and 100% happy? Like, it just blows my mind. But when we wear ally as an identity, really bad things happen. One of them is the hostility and resistance to criticism. So when you criticize an ally, sometimes they attack back and they say things like, oh, come on, I'm doing my best. Or, why can't you just be grateful? That's one I've gotten a few times. And other times, well, if you're just going to criticize me for trying to be an ally, maybe I just shouldn't try. Right? I'm just going to take my ball and go home. So if some of you happened to read the Brian Leiter post before he took it down and then whitewashed it, one of the things he ended with was, don't worry, these people, these crazy McKinnons, aren't alienating me. I'm still an ally. Right? Utterly resistant to criticism. And one of the problems is that we get to wear this identity badge, whether or not we've ever done any ally-like behavior, ever. Right? You just say, you identify as an ally, give me a badge. And then you conceive of yourself as an ally. Leiter still conceives of himself as an ally. Explicitly, he said so. Even though he's done things like attack a female graduate student and then call me, an untenured professor, singularly unhinged and crazy. Those are not ally behaviors. Okay? You don't get to keep the identity in the face of counter-evidence. And yet that's what people do. Because when you have an identity, counter-instances to that identity don't shift your self-conception. So this is a problem broadly with just allies and ally culture. Because we wear it as an identity, it produces these effects. And so let's talk a little bit about this but I'm an ally stuff. So a really prominent instance of this happened recently with the meltdown of Piers Morgan over the appearance of Janet Mock, a trans woman of color, on his show. While she was on his show, he used a lot of problematic phrases and tropes and sensationalization of her life, saying things like, oh, well, you were born a man, right? To which I think she gloriously responded, no, I was born a baby. And in the graphics under her image during the interview, which she can't see while she's doing the interview, because Piers is like, but you didn't complain during the interview. Okay, well, she's in an interview. She'll complain after. Calm down. It had things like, was a man until 18, which is explicitly how she does not identify with her gendered past. And so when she saw the show afterwards and saw the graphics, she tweeted about it being a problem. She said, Piers Morgan, I was not formally a man. So please stop sensationalizing my life and misgendering trans women. And then she tags her book. And there was an explosion on Twitter of criticism for Piers Morgan. So he was getting called out. In some cases, called in. Now, how do allies respond to being called out? By attacking the people calling them out. So here's what Piers tweeted. In an utter beginning of a meltdown, as my friend Audrey Yap calls, it was the McKinnon. Totally support 100% equality for LGBT community, by the way, and have done so on air, so find all this Janet Mock business utterly ludicrous. It completely dismisses the criticism, which is utterly, utterly warranted criticism of him. He continues to tweet after 24 hours of being attacked. I agree there should be an apology made regarding my interview with Janet Mock, and I expect her to make it to me on air tonight in a follow-up interview. Apologize to me, your ally, for attacking and criticizing me. Never mind the crappy things I said to and about you. And he kept going. He says, being transgender doesn't give you the right to slur, distort, and ridicule someone who supports the issue 100%. Shame on you, Janet Mock. And he coined this new phrase, cisphobia, that all the attacks of him were cisphobia, which should ring a lot like white people saying of people of color criticizing systems of oppression that, oh, that's reverse racism. Or men saying of women feminists criticizing systems of oppression that, well, this is misandry. No, this is not cisphobia. This is calling out shitty behavior. And yet what happens is the allies attack back. But not just this. They want credit for what they did do good. Right? He starts off by saying, look, I've done so on air before. Give me credit. Give me my cookie. And so we call this not just the asking for a reward for any good behavior, but the actual demand for praise, cookie-seeking behavior. And so here's a nice little comic. So here's a blog comment. Manly Man said, make me a sandwich woman. And Slick, who has a lot of problems with misogyny, says, that's sexist, yo. And then he puts on his cape and says, I called out sexism. I did. Me. I am social justice. And then Grandma comes in and gives him a cookie, and he says, I got a cookie, oh, happy day. And that's what allies are like. Cookies are this external recognition for doing the right thing. And not only do allies just want them, they sometimes demand them. Give me some credit. Oddly enough, often allies want credit or this cookie for simply not engaging in bad behavior. They want recognition for not being an abject asshole. So in my case, with the University of Waterloo, people said to me that I should give the chair, who was mispronouncing me for a long time, some credit Or I should be grateful for all he's done for my career. And I thought about what he's done for my career because he didn't write me letters of recommendation, right? All I could think was that he gave me the same level of teaching assignments that I had before I transitioned, the same after. So basically, I should be grateful that he didn't discriminate against me. That's what they're saying. But this is common to ally culture. And so that's it. I'm done. I don't want to talk about allies. If you tell me an ally, I'm just rolling my eyes. Because it's bullshit. Allies focus on intentions. They wear it as an identity. They're insensitive. They're hostile to criticism. So that's it. I'm done with allies and ally culture. In a little bit, I'll talk about what we should replace that with. But before we get there, rather than just talking about some of all the pragmatic problems with being an ally, I'm going to talk a little bit about a conceptual problem. Like, I think the way that we define an ally is broken anyway. So typically, the way that we define an ally is we have different groups of people with different intersectional identities, such that we have in-groups like a woman of color, and the ally is the out-group member with more social privilege, right? So the white cis dude is the ally to the black woman in this case. But that's not true. The sort of people who can stand up to help other people can be other in-group members. A lesbian woman can stand up to an instance of homophobia or lesbophobia to another lesbian woman, right? They can be another in-group member. Or a person with less social privilege can stand up for someone with more, right? A queer woman of color can stand up to a cis white lesbian woman or a cis straight woman, right? So we can support anyone no matter who we are, no matter who they are. So this concept and the deployment of allies is just broken. Not just that, I honestly think ally culture produces more harm than good. All of the worst instances of gaslighting I've ever heard of or have ever experienced came at the hands of allies. Often, one of the problems with gaslighting is that being gaslit by an ally is worse than the thing that we went to complain about. Because it's a kind of betrayal. It creates isolation. I went to this person who's supposed to help me, and they just dismissed what I'm saying. So now what? In fact, when shit hit the fan at Waterloo for me, I contacted a bunch of my support group outside the department, and a couple of them just said, you need to keep your mouth shut and get out. Right? Don't try to call anyone in. Don't talk to anyone. Just get out. Because I felt utterly isolated. And that's what allies do to people. Allies isolate people. And yet, these people who did these things still consider themselves allies. In fact, exemplary allies. They're the people the university turns to do ally training. They're the people who win diversity awards. And yet they do this crap. So let's just get rid of it. So what should we replace it with? Well, we should replace it with the active bystander. So here's a useful quote from Desmond Tutu. If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. Now I understand that we all have different intersectional identities, different levels of social privilege. We can't always be an active bystander in every situation, right? It's not safe in many cases. But we have to recognize that we're still there. We are still a bystander no matter who we are. So I think Carrie's example of the what it's like post is fantastic about the wax dripping on the nipples. The faculty all nervously laughed. Maybe they all saw that what was said was inappropriate. And yet every single one of them chose the side of the oppressor. No one did anything. When we see something bad happen, we have a choice. We can be an active bystander or a passive bystander. We're a bystander no matter what, so you've got to choose which kind you'll be in that instance. And all those faculty chose to be passive bystanders. And so what was the net effect for the person who was affected, right? Not only did she feel isolated and that maybe they didn't care about her, but it creates this self-doubt that she even properly perceived what happened. That's pernicious. So, what should you do? If you see something bad happen, if you're in the social position to do something, right, it's not unsafe for you to step up, just do something. Often the objection I get is, Rachel, look, I would really love to do something, but I'm really afraid of saying the wrong thing. Right? That's the objection I get all the time. And yet, coming from a position of the people or of a person who needs that sort of support, that action, I'll tell you this, imperfect action is better than nothing. Just do something. And not only do something, but make it visible to the affected person. If someone says something sexist to me at a Christmas party, you need to step in right there and say, whoa, that was sexist. That's not okay. Don't wait until that night to email them. You have to make your intervention public to the person affected. That's how you show support. Or if you do send this sort of email type message, you let the person know that you did that, right? You show your support. You don't just support them. However, when you let them know that you've got their back, don't look for a cookie, okay? You're not telling them to get praise. You're telling them to show your support. But this also means, because imperfect action is better than inaction, it's still an imperfect action. You need to be prepared for criticism. So you step in, you do something. It's imperfect, it's better than nothing. That person might now attack you for having done something imperfect. Remember, they've just been harmed. They've had their toes stepped on. They're just angry. So don't take it personal. In fact, you should thank them for being willing to have this conversation with you. So when you're an active bystander, the focus is always on accountability. No one expects you to be perfect. Even when you're not an active bystander. I mean, I say stupid shit too, right? It happens, you're human. But be accountable for when you screw up. So listen to that criticism. Even though you've acted and that's better than nothing, you have to listen to the criticism. Whoops. Don't defend your actions. Don't say, well, I was just doing my best. Okay, we know that. Don't defend. This is not about you. Okay, this is about the person trying to tell you what you could have done better or that it wasn't perfect. Which means you should acknowledge that they're willing to tell you this. Because typically we only criticize the actions of active bystanders if we care about them. Okay, so here's a really powerful way to be a better active bystander. They're called implementation intentions. So what you do is you sit and you think about, if something happens, what will I do? Because when you're in the heat of the moment of something bad happening, sometimes you can't think quick enough about what to do, and then you just decide to do nothing. So what you do is you think ahead of time. If this type of injustice happens, here's what I'll do. That saves you the cognitive work. You'll be far more likely to be successful. We have tons of psychology data for how this works. So for example, when someone's mispronounced, I will what? What will you do? This is something you can write down, like on the back of a handout. For example, if someone uses the pronoun he when it's supposed to be she, what will you do? Well, I'll tell you what I do. I just say she. It's she. Right? That's what you should have used for this person. Right? I already know ahead of time how I'm going to respond. So when it happens, it's automatic. When someone says something racist, I will what? My response is usually just be like, whoa, that was racist. It's pretty easy, but it's also automatic. When a colleague puts down a student and says that you should leave the profession because you're a danger to academic freedom and the rule of law, like a certain Brian Leiter did on the Feminist Philosophers blog, what will you do? Well, you can read what I did, because I stood up and I said, that's not okay. All right? Okay. So as a profession, as people, what we have to do is cultivate active bystanders. Being an active bystander has costs, social costs, personal, emotional costs. So we need to think about ways to reduce those costs, especially when they come up, but also to remove them before they even come up. So we need to create spaces to be active bystanders, to praise active bystanders, but not in a cookie-seeking way, but in a behavior modification way. And that means that when active bystanders get attacked, like certain people recently did, you publicly support them. Private messages and emails of support means a little. It's nice personally, but it's not a real show of support. What they need is public support. So if you've got a blog or you've got a website, you've got any sort of platform to say that so-and-so attacked an active bystander, that was wrong. I'm standing up in support. Do it. So moving forward, be an active bystander. Make your support visible in public. Be accountable. Thank you. Do you want a chair? It's easier. Because we have implicit biases about who we call on.
I'll make a cue, and we'll start with you, and everybody else has questions.
So thank you very much. I think you very accurately and perceptively zeroed in on the problem with allies. I had a similar experience in a department where, in the end, the allies did far more harm for me, and I had to leave that job. It is a problem. And I wonder, I mean, I think your idea of active bystanders is a very valuable one. And there's actually formal studies related to bullying in workplaces that show that that is really the only thing that stops the bullying.
Yeah.
Right? And the bullies continue when, you know, the other people in that employment environment just say nothing.
Yep.
And the most effective antidote is just people speaking up. So, very good advice. Thank you.
Thank you. I concluded.
Roman.
Hi. So thank you for your talk. It is very relevant to lots of things, including my own. My question is with being an active bystander, choosing to be one, or being the person that even felt like she was harmed, and choosing to say something, and negotiating that with professional aspiration. So, how do you manage that, right? Like, how do you say something when you feel like, you know, like this person has power over you, right? And you want to continue on in the profession.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like, I feel like I just need to shut up, keep my head down, power through, publish, and just, like, get a tenure track job somewhere, and that's when I can finally be an active bystander.
That was the advice given to me, too. I think, personally, that's probably the best way. But this is why I wanted the point about cultivating spaces and atmospheres for being active bystanders. And it can't be on the person who's affected, right? It can't be the person who's been harmed, even though it so often is. They're the most vulnerable person in most cases. I mean, how did I manage? Well, I didn't listen to that advice. So I had not yet contacted any of my department. Well, I contacted the one ally, and she gaslit the hell out of me. And so then I'm like, oh, now I'm isolated. This is lovely. Should I even be talking to my supervisor, who's like an associate dean and past department chair? And my one friend, who I think had the wisest advice, was just like, no, you need to shut the hell up, keep your head down, get out. I didn't. I pushed it, and things just kept getting worse. Because now I'm not only dealing with the harm and the person causing the harm, I'm trying to talk to the allies, making things worse. And so I've got all these multiple avenues of harm now, and it just makes it worse. So in the short term, thinking on the individual level, unfortunately, sometimes you just have to get out to where you have power. And a lot of what I did was, because I was contingent faculty, I was on the job market, I waited until I had the tenure track job, and then I stopped being quiet. Now, I'm very fortunate to have been hired by a department that knows that I do this kind of work. In fact, I sent an email warning my chair that I'm giving this talk and I might be causing some shit, just so you know. And he said, yeah, we expect that. That's okay. So hopefully you'll find that sort of space and that gives you power. But until then, find as much external support as you can. Build a network of friends and support outside the place that that's happening. That's what got me through it.
Yeah, that was a really good talk. My question, I guess, on this, wondering what the allies would say in response, is it seems like a lot of allies would want to say, but that's what I am, I'm an active bystander. That's what it means to be an ally. So it seems like what your issue is kind of the label of ally, this kind of identity that it creates. And is that not something that an active bystander would have as well? Do you think they would think they have this label and this identity like an ally would? Where's the distinction?
So that's the worry, philosophically speaking. So this will turn into a paper with a colleague, Kate Abramson, about basically this title. So that's the objection. That's sort of the central objection. Like, won't people just start using active bystander as a replacement for allies? And I want to push back against that because to me, an active bystander is context specific. An event happened where you passive or active in that instant. And so you can't wear the identity unless you did something, right? And not only, I don't think you really get to wear the identity as an active bystander because it's something you do, not something you are. And the problem is ally is, and always has been, something you are, not something you do. And so it had things backwards from the start.
I'm not sure this is exactly appropriate, but I'll say it anyway. 2 weeks ago, I had this major operation on a Wednesday. And when I finally sort of could read, despite the campaign, by Friday, I went to a blog that's very dear to me. And I'm one of the few bloggers on the blog, feminist philosophers, who uses her name. And I thought, oh shit, what happened? And the thing about, and this is when you and Leiter had, I don't know what, because he then removed what he said. So I couldn't even see the context to figure out whether this was male menopause, that, he was just, or whether he was just acting a character, or whether he was drunk, or what was going on. So I did want to mention that, though, because it was a case. And I hope I would have come in and said to one of the most powerful people in the philosophy profession, you cannot do that.
So I was,
But I wanted to explain that it wasn't that I was
oh no.
not an ally. I was, in fact, totally live cooking.
Well, yeah, first, thank you, Anne, but I mean, I'm going to push back about that, but I'm not, like, no, we're not talking about allies. So this isn't about whether or not you were an ally. You didn't have the instance to be an active bystander, right, for physical reasons. But I will say that I was supremely disappointed in our profession that day. I downgraded my views of a lot of people, not just the one person who harmed me, but what happened in that thread with feminist philosophers was that I was actually having a good faith conversation and argument with Leiter over the Ludlow thing and whether or not it's appropriate for the students to be protesting and his really weird definition of vigilante justice, which seems to include any civil disobedience. And then a female graduate student posts under pseudonym, current student, basically saying that, like, Leiter, the focus that you have is really troubling. Some of my fellow women grad students are really troubled by this and kind of disgusted that you're focusing on his academic freedom to teach rather than the student's freedom from being sexually harassed. And then Leiter attacks the student and says, look, if this is true, then you need to get out of the profession, right? You're a danger to the law, academic freedom, blah, 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 blah. I come in and say, look, current student, don't leave the profession. Don't listen to Leiter. His kind will be aging and gone soon. Surround yourself by good people in the profession. Good people are coming up. And I went back into the thread to recomment, to recall him out, and I made sure to put my full name in. So up until then, I'd just been commenting by Rachel, which I typically do on blogs, just because I don't want people to Google search my comments when they search my name. But most people know that a Rachel commenting is probably me. I know there are lots of Rachels, but anyway. I went back in to put my full name, and if you look at a lot of the other people calling out Leiter, they were either anonymous or first name only. And these people have tenure, and they wouldn't put their full name. And the 3 people who put their full name, Stacy, the blog sort of poster, Gogan? Yeah. So Stacy, me, and Matt Drabeck, well, me and Matt were the 2 people attacked in Leiter's subsequent post. So it makes sense that people would post anonymously, and yet the people who put their full names, none of whom have tenure. So the people with all the social power were the biggest cowards. And I got a huge amount of private support for the most part. I got like 70 new Facebook friends over this, and lots of messages and emails of support, which is great on a personal level. The blogs were silent. In fact, they were worse than silent. They were posting about how horrible Leiter was to current student and never mentioned what he did to me. And yet, Drabeck, me, and current student who contacted me because I put my full name all agreed that what he did to me was the worst thing of all. And yet the blogs were silent on that, but they were focusing on this other thing. So it wasn't just silence, it was erasure. Right? That was itself another injustice. And when I talk to some of the bloggers, they're like, oh, well, you're just looking for like kudos and cookies. I'm like, no, this is about holding him accountable. I don't want kudos. Right? I don't believe in seeking cookies. So I was deeply offended. And then fortunately, a couple people on the Feminist Philosophers blog finally posted posts calling out what happened. But they were the only ones for the most part. So our profession sucks.
I had a question about the active bystander idea. It's kind of just a general question about what to do when you're confronted with an instance of kind of casual sexism, which I'm sure everybody is confronted with all the time. And when there isn't necessarily, for one thing, it could be a private conversation, and when somebody says that, refers to something as being girly, for example, or, something like that, which happened to me really recently. So either there's no potential bystanders present, or the bystanders that are present don't really see the issue, and they don't, that they're not in a position to be an active bystander. So my question is, in those situations, are there any kind of productive ways of kind of being your own active bystander and just, making it known that there's an issue without alienating the person and without, because I think about this a lot, and I never have the self-possession to actually figure out what the right thing to say is. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've sort of lived my life being my own active bystander. Part of it is I have a reputation for it, so people can expect it. But I'll start with the point about other people not recognizing it first. So that's a huge problem, and that is part of why we need feminism as a required course in undergraduate degrees. Because I think that sort of education lets people know, right? There's something to standpoint epistemology. If you occupy a particular social location, that often makes it very difficult for you to even perceive things that happen. And by occupying the other position, it makes it easier to perceive, right? And perceive as, it's actually this perceptual thing. And so we need to stop treating feminist philosophy as not real philosophy and that these things don't really matter. I think that it needs to be like a required course in undergraduate programs. Like if you're doing a major in philosophy, you have to take a feminist philosophy course. I think that that's something that in the next 40 years, I want my career to have accomplished. So there's that. By having workshops like this and pointing things out that are problematic, people will start being better. I mean, it's going to be slow and long. Now, on how to be effective with being your own active bystander, I mean, it's going to create risks. And I think the best way to go about it is to think about trying to make it a calling in rather than a calling out. And so when someone says something sexist, like, oh, that's so girly, and like, hey, that's sexist. Let's talk about that, right? Unfortunately, because people hate being called out and they can't recognize the difference between being called out and called in, you're gonna get a shitload of hostility. And I think you just kind of gotta do what you can, hope for the best, duck.
Just kind of follow up to the distinction between ally and active bystander. So you made the point that an ally isn't necessarily active, right? That identity is not necessarily based on action. And then I just wanted to add, another distinction might be that when an ally does act, it's often not public. It's often presented in terms of, oh, don't do anything, but say anything. I will go and talk to this person, or I will do things behind the scenes. And I think the key thing about being an active bystander and why that's effective is that it is public. Everyone can see it. And about the concern of the power relations, I don't think it actually gets that much better when you're in a tenure position, because then you're worried about, am I going to get tenure? So I think you just have to say to yourself, look, I'm going to speak up when I can, right? No matter what level of my career I'm at. And, hopefully there will be enough people around me who will join in, and if not, well then maybe that's not a department worth being in, right? If like you're the only one who's constantly speaking up, then,
Yeah.
So that's...
Yeah, so I'll start at the end. Yeah, I'll start at the last comment and move my way forward. So the tenure track risk comment, I mean, academia is just this completely screwed up institution because we're on this perpetual treadmill, right? We're undergrad, I want to get into a good grad school. I'm in grad school, I want to get a tenure track job. I'm in a tenure track job, I want to get tenure. I'm in tenure, I want to get full professor. I want grants, I want, right? You want to keep progressing your career so that risk never stops, ever. Like it's conceptually just not going to happen. And so part of it is we have to navigate these risks and make some really hard choices. So when I went on the job market, I had some work out in feminist philosophy, and I really made it clear that this is who I am and this is partly what I do. I mean, like I do like 10% of my work in feminist philosophy, even though that's what people think I only do. And so I've just decided that, look, I'm going to be this person. If they don't give me tenure, it's probably going to be more trouble for them than they want. But the nice thing about where I got hired is I don't know. Actually, it's South Carolina. So we'll see. There's been this massive blow up over the College of Charleston for having a college reads program with a book by Bechdel, right, a lesbian author. And so the legislature defunded that program because it's promoting the gay lifestyle. And so how are they going to feel about a out lesbian trans woman on campus talking about this crap? We'll see. Okay. The first point you made, though, was about how allies often don't act, and I think it's because they don't want to rock the boat, right? Because part of it is they have to work with these people, so they don't want to damage their interpersonal relationships. And so if you're this disadvantaged person, so you're junior faculty and they're all tenured, they don't want to piss off their tenured people because they have to work with them, but you might not get tenure, right? So off you go. Worse if you're a grad student, worse yet if you're an undergrad, okay? So yes, I think that's a feature and I hate it. I hate it so much. The other thing, though, is that you're right that allies often do their interventions behind the scenes quietly. And the big problem with that, though, is you have to make your interventions public in some way. They never report back to the affected person that they had this conversation. So they might say, don't worry, I'll go talk to them. And then you're like, so did you talk to them? Yeah, but that's confidential. So what did you, like roughly, just come on, ballpark it for me. What did you say? Are they contrite? Will they not do it again? Are you, no, that's confidential. Oh, well, fuck you, thanks so much. This helps me not at all. That happened to me too, and that set me off. So, yes, I agree.
I just wanted to comment on another thing that comes up with Colorado. And I think really to some extent we have to really very seriously consider the professions that one's getting involved with for just the sorts of things you said. People discussing, and in the Colorado report, they were commented on that a significant number of people in the department have just withdrawn from the department. And they weren't going in unless they absolutely had to. They didn't go to department meetings. And speaking as somebody who has flirted with that, I tell you that is a very dangerous strategy, because the next thing is that you're not collegial, and you may have protected yourself from a couple of people, but you have protected yourself from, say, the dean, right? Who's going to hear about how uncooperative you are. So this is all a very difficult thing, and I think there are two major strands of advice in the literature on what to do if you're in a situation where you don't have active bystanders and you are being constantly harassed either sexually or otherwise. And one is you stay and you just try to avoid it as much as possible. You go underground. And that, I can tell you, is dangerous. And the other is you get out.
Yeah. And then you get the crap like, oh, well, this will just happen wherever you go, right? And often they use that sentence to sort of get you to not leave, right? Just, look, this will happen there, why do you want to leave? But you're right. So an MA student a couple weeks ago came out, so people come out and tell me all kinds of bad shit that happens to them because I, one, I'm generally an active bystander when I can, and I have a reputation for talking about these topics, so people tell me all kinds of crazy stuff. So this person, oh God, no. No. Yeah. Anyway, she came out and told me that a fellow graduate student sexually assaulted her. And immediately the other grad students, guys, started gaslighting her and saying things like, oh, but he's married, and so are you, so you must have come on to him or something, right? Like, just nonsense. And as an MA student, a first-year MA student, because in Canada we do MAs before PhDs, she's already withdrawing from department life at the MA level. And being part of department life is a huge part of your career and career development. And so she's being harmed already. And so we think about leaky pipelines, maybe this has a little bit to do with it. And so when you make the point about thinking about the profession you're going into, I mean, how many of us actually seriously considered our job prospects or the social prospects of being a philosopher? Probably none. And so I used to have this position of the talk to prospective grad students, right, undergrads. And I used to just take the position of run, get out. And I no longer take that view. I now take a view of informed consent, but I'm going to tell you all the bad shit that happens. Sit down, this is going to take a while. And I try to communicate to them that, look, you think you're special. You think you're a snowflake. We all think that. Every single one of us thought that. And then my view is once they push forward with wanting to do graduate studies, they get my full support, full and unquestioning. And I will go to bat for anybody, clearly, even if it's Brian Leiter. The irony, of course, is it probably helped my career, because what he did was so incandescently and transparently vicious that I probably made more friends than I lost.
So this could be entitled, in fact, why there should be so few women in philosophy. Joe.
Yeah.
Back to the leaky pipeline topic. With regard to the distinction between what people do and what people are and allies wanting to receive some credit, how did you feel about the distinction that Carrie mentioned between actually just rejecting people based on their gender versus actual sexual advances? Did you feel like it had any significance?
Oh, the two types of discrimination, or the two types of harassment. One is like actual sexual harassment, and one is more like microaggressions and implicit biases and stuff. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that paper is really provocative in that it not only draws out and makes that distinction, but shows that there's like correlations differently. Like one, no correlation at all between the gender representation and sexual harassment and assault versus sort of the softer kinds of harassment and assault, right? Like being ignored or being talked over or the microaggressions, yeah. So I think that's interesting.
Well, because to me it just seems like pointing out that it doesn't reach the point of actual sexual harassment is in a way possibly taking credit in some format if we're not, specifically acknowledging that these more minor rejection happens on a daily basis.
Oh my God, it's a grind. To this woman who told me about her sexual assault at the MA level, the conversation I had to have with her involved her coming to realize that every woman in philosophy has her own story. We all have something, maybe not an assault, but some nexus of shit that we've gone through or are going through. And it's daily, right? And it just doesn't stop, and it comes from places you don't expect it to. And I think sometimes the worst it comes from are the allies.
And one of the things you have to cope with is its effect on your personality. I mean, so you're incandescently angry for some of us.
Oh my God, everyone thinks I'm this huge bitch. Partly right.
We have one question. In that case, after we thank our speaker, I'm going to ask you to sit tight for some pre-lunch announcements. But first, let's all